Thank you. I often fly through a JFK airport in New York, where you need to take escalators down under an active taxiing area, then back up again to a second set of departure gates. The passage is so long and slow that you can become bored while riding the moving stairs. I find myself looking at the plates of steel beneath my feet, formed in a pattern of thin parallel lines with indentations between the lines. This is the distinctive look of escalator tread. I always feel the urge to touch these thin metallic plateaus and crevices. I want to run my fingers across the smooth but broken surface every time I'm moving on an escalator. But I'd be embarrassed to stoop down and satisfy this childish urge. As we mature, we gradually abandon this kind of primary exploration of the feel of the physical environment. It all becomes familiar. We shift to observing and acquiring the conventions of culture. In short, we learn how to behave. The inhibitions of culture intervene in our daily experience. If I were to touch the tread of an escalator, bystanders would look askance. Analogous inhibition affects my professional life. As an art historian, the expectation is that I'm investigating culture, not sensation, not feeling. Most of my colleagues study the meaning of works of art with respect to the cultural context and the socially oriented statements that the works appear to make. But this practice can be limiting and sometimes misleading with respect to an artist's motivation. Historians have often viewed large abstractions like Richard Serra's sculptures as demonstrations of power, whether oriented to social class or to gender and male privilege. But whatever such works might signify within the prevailing cultural coding, they remain explorations of scale, weight, and other sensory phenomena. The cultural coding may change, the weight of the object will not. These sculptures affect human emotions in a fundamental way. I suspect that touching the JFK escalator would prove similar to other experiences that I've had, but I can't say the same for my experience of the prints, drawings, and sculptures of Richard Serra. They make me anxious, if only because the encounter causes me to realize that I have very limited rational means of explaining the sensations that I feel. I can address Serra's work only by referring to the physicality of the materials and to feeling itself. Talking about the history of sculpture will take me only so far. That's a risky conclusion for an art historian to reach. I'm supposed to be working with the history of culture, not with immediate feelings, and certainly not with my own emotions. As a historian, I shouldn't become so romantic. Yet Serra states that he wants his work to provide, quote, room for anxiety. His remark applies not only to the notorious works of sculpture that investigate balance and gravity, but to virtually everything he's ever produced. His sculptures hardly belong within the category of sculpture as we've known it. His drawings cover great expanses and lack encompassing composition. They relate more to architecture than to mural painting. And his prints, because so much handwork is involved in making the edition, often amount to sets of remarkably large monotypes, each slightly different from the others, yet without any investment in the personal authorship of the surface. We experience the force of the print as a direct sensory phenomenon. We don't worry over the personality of the artist or the personality of the team of printers. Serra's art causes us to think of ourselves, not to think of who Serra is. His art makes us unusually conscious of our own feelings. Here's an etching of 1991, about 6 feet in height. Its title is Vestry 3. When I encounter it, I might know, but don't need to know, the background facts of this name. It identifies an island in Iceland where Serra created 18 on-site sculptures from basalt. Perhaps the irregular shape seen in the print has an origin in a natural form that Serra observed. Whatever the case, the biographical contextual facts have little bearing on my experience. Instead of investigating Iceland, I imagine touching the heaviness and blackness of this surface, and with my fingertips, I imagine assessing the raised, irregular edges of the form. I suppose that I aspire to the freedom of the artist, but to touch the work would be that much more improper than touching an escalator. And I've learned something along the way. I've learned that I can touch Serra's work by vision alone. By visual perception alone, this etching seems to satisfy a desire to touch. I think that Serra's prints succeed in translating touch into vision. The physicality of these works is so compelling that my fantasy of touch becomes real. Or to put it another way, the visual impact of Serra's forms is perceived so viscerally that vision acquires the bodily immediacy of touch. You don't feel objectively removed from Serra's surfaces in the way that visual experience normally seems to be felt at a distance. You feel compelled to draw near to the print despite its size and discernible shape. The work seems close in, like touch. Its physicality is so real, so immediate, that its closeness can be cause for anxiety. Serra's art has always been all too real. His subject is not fantasy, but physical being. This early work of 1967, titled To Lift, is not an image of something other than itself, but the result of the action to which the title refers. Every time that I've seen this sculpture, I've wanted to violate gallery protocol and give the object a little tug, to experience the feel of the lift for myself and to feel the material's resistance to further lifting. Yet by vision alone, I seem to get remarkably close to the experience I imagine. Serra's sculptures bring vision and touch into correspondence, and the same is true of his drawings and his prints. His art transports me to a situation independent of culture, as if I could experience life before culture and all of its conventions. I turn back to a world of primordial sensations from which, as a physical being, I've never actually departed. That's why there's such a strong impulse to touch. It's a primitive response. With a sheet of vulcanized rubber, you can grasp the edge at its center and lift the material up. This is what Serra demonstrates. The weight, density, and tensile strength of the material allow it to remain in this altered form, lifted. Here, by way of comparison with Serra's sculpture, is an image of lifting. And here again is real lifting. In technical terms, we would call Serra's form an index of lifting rather than an icon of lifting, which means that we can infer the action from the form that results. Serra said of this work, "It struck me that instead of thinking what a sculpture is going to be and how you're going to do it, what if you just took an action in relation to a material and didn't worry about the results. Like his sculpture, Serra's prints, with rare exceptions, favor the index, the action, over the icon, the image. This fact may cause his titles to be confusing. This screen print of 1985 has the title Robeson, referring to Paul Robeson, the singer, athlete, and activist. Do we somehow have his image or even an index of his activity? Neither possibility applies. Serra sometimes uses titles to pay homage to a historical figure or to invoke a concept or simply to make a statement. Often the title has little bearing on the direct experience of the work. Language doesn't equal experience, Serra says. He goes beyond where language can go. This is a lithograph from 1981 with a title that makes a statement. The title is The Moral Majority Sucks. I might agree that the concept of the moral majority of the 1970s and 80s was and is politically pernicious. To put my disapproval colloquially, I too would say it sucks. Moral majority was a political slogan implying that the great mass of Americans silently supported military intervention as the moral action of a moral nation, while they rejected social intervention such as regulations to affirm women's equal rights. This is hardly the message I get from experiencing the print itself. It engages me in the starkness of its black inked form and its shape on the paper, which measures about 5 feet across. The black shape is parallel to the edge on the right side, but parallel on no other side, so it's highly irregular, it's off the grid. In fact, it has nothing to do with the so-called modernist grid or any kind of compositional structure. It makes no references to visual order or to visual culture. Many of Serra's shapes, either in prints or in drawings, derive from his study of his own sculptural planes and volumes. His shapes introduce an ambiguous quality of perspective, so ambiguous that we can't imagine of what object the shape could be the shadow or the projection. The form quickly defeats the eye's capacity to classify it as advancing or receding. Nor, in the case of this print, does the severe application of the deep black lithographic ink allow a sense of the modulation of light. Lacking modulation, there's no allusion to natural illumination. So with no perspective and no illumination, the shape can't be a reference to any view or object other than itself. It can't be an image. It can't be a picture. Serra's printed blacks tend to be so dark and saturated that they acquire a strange brightness of black, which I hope is not too much of a contradiction. Description becomes inadequate. The dark shape within this print registers as a specific black form, and any connection to anything else remains at best ambiguous. We have to experience Serra's shape for what it is in its particularity. The shape now on the screen proves ever more irregular if we give it some close attention. If we focus on the upper left corner of this quadrilateral shape, we see that it isn't truly a quadrilateral. It has a fifth side because Serra allowed his drawing for the lithographic print to run off the edge of the plate. The upper left corner is truncated or blunted. What does it mean when the quadrilateral that we expect to see becomes five-sided? I don't think that such a question generates definitive answers. The implications of Serra's works work suit an existentialist world. Things happen, events are there to be experienced, we keep living and looking. Serra's title in this case, The Moral Majority Sucks, reflects his social concerns. The advantage to making a statement through a title is that it can't be censored. It's simply the title of the work and travels with the work whenever the work is addressed in public or reproduced in a book. I feel that I should mention the title simply because it's there, even though its relation to the work is arbitrary. Ironically, a museum with a policy of avoiding political statement will end up making one indirectly if they have a Serra show with wall labels and a catalog. So we have a bit of cultural subversion in a work with little relation to culture. Serra has occasionally made direct statements in prints produced for charitable organizations or political campaigns. The screen print of 2017 distinguishes the refined lettering of the word president, black on gold, from the coarse hand-stamped quality of the word fake, rendered in red. Like a shape that fits no pattern, this juxtaposition of two different graphic languages addresses a question that ought never to be raised, since all presidents are by definition genuine. The red lettering challenges the normality of the black lettering. It lets a viewer know that something has gone culturally wrong. A lithograph of 2004 challenging the validity of American military action in Iraq has a title that can be read as either Stop BS or Stop Bush. But bear in mind that works of this kind are exceptional cases produced to be sold in support of a specific social cause. Back now to the screen print titled Robeson. It towers over its viewer because its height, because it is 8.5 feet in height. We could be clever and say that the print titled Robeson not only honors a towering cultural figure, but is itself a towering achievement in the annals of printmaking. But such metaphorical associations deflect from the direct apprehension of the physical object. Its heavily stroked surface and its unusual, rather disturbing geometry, these material features don't tower. The print projects the tactile sensation of its thick paint stick surface. We imagine the touch of it even without touching. And the work that's in the exhibition downstairs is a very good example of the kind of surface that you see there, only it's smaller. But the paint stick is applied with a lot of pressure by pulling downward or across. For the downward in drawings, across in printing. For those who may not know, paint stick is a brand name for a very dense, opaque oil crayon. Serra doesn't use it in its stick form. He melts many individual sticks and refashions them into brick-like units that can be grasped with both hands. This allows him to apply the oily black in broad strokes with a lot of pressure on large surfaces. And the stroking can be done by Serra himself, or it can be done by anyone else that he thinks is capable of doing it. In the print titled Robeson, the character of Serra's vertical pull of paint stick downward is captured in a screen printing process, very much like Serra's use of screens to make drawings. The paint stick is forced through the screen with hand pressure. If it were applied in thinner crayon form, the stick would break under the pressure of the stroke. The weighty force of the pulling and the resistance of the material, as well as the actual weightiness of the completed print, all this becomes accessible to the eye. There are no illusions. This is the result of an action. It's an object, not an image. And as you may know, Serra makes drawings, unique works on paper, exactly the same way, and those can be done either vertically or horizontally. Serra's explanation of the independent quality of his screen prints is worth quoting. In 1991, he said this: "In the silkscreen process, the paint stick particle is more fragmented than it is with drawing. There's more of a fluctuation within the surface. People who often look at prints like the fact that there's a tonal variation and gradation within the depth of the field of the silkscreen." Serra's screen prints and etchings require hand finishing and retouching to get the degree of tonal variation to a level that the artist accepts in relation to other qualities of the specific print. The visual scale of the Robeson print strains the eye's capacity to assess the orientation of its rectilinear form, which has an inexplicable irregularity. The rectilinear shape slants off the orthogonal at its left side, disturbing expectations. The slant isn't matched on the right side, so we aren't looking at a trapezoid or a rhomboid. This is still essentially a rectangle, but with a defect. To say that the form is leaning would be too anthropomorphic. We might just call it a quadrilateral of no specific category, one of a kind. For a form to be irregular, it must refer to the regular version of itself. But Serra's shapes do not refer elsewhere. They exist only because Serra made them with no general type to which they belong. The effect of the slant in Robeson, a feature that has no apparent cause, is analogous to the truncated edge in the moral majority sucks. The physical qualities of this print, its scale, its visual texture, its curious geometry, ensure that the work becomes both absorbing and distracting. We must sense it, we must perceive it, because it can't be shunted off into a category. Rather than depicting something, it is what it is. Along these lines, here's another of Serra's statements. You can cover a surface with black without risking metaphorical and other misreadings. The use of any other color would be the extension of coloration, with its unavoidable allusions to nature. From Gutenberg on, black has always been synonymous with a graphic or print procedure. I'm interested in the mechanization of the graphic procedure. I'm not interested in the paint illusion gesture. Serra is suggesting that we should stick to the empirical physical facts of his art. His stroke deposits blackness. It doesn't gesture. It doesn't configure. I'm fascinated by an anecdote that Serra has repeated in recent interviews, a story of physical facts. He reflects on a memory of his boyhood in San Francisco around age 7 or 8, living near the Pacific Ocean. I'd walk the beach and back, he says. On the way home, I'd follow my footprints in the sand. I realized that my experience of walking down the beach was completely different from my experience walking up the beach. I couldn't understand why that would be. Possessing the psychology of a child, Serra reacted with curiosity, even wonder. For an adult, the same degree of disorientation might entail anxiety. You would feel lost. When we retrace our steps, we expect to experience what we already know from having taken the same route in the other direction. What was so hard for the boy to understand? Apparently, he had already mastered the logic of commutability. the idea that ordered relations preserve their orderly form when inverted or reversed. To express the thought symbolically or algebraically, if A plus B equals C, then B plus A also equals C. Reversing the order of the terms leads to the same conclusion. You get back to where you started. By the logic of it, walking up should have equaled walking down. The boy's footprints guaranteed that the trace was the same. If it did not feel the same, then Serra had somehow allowed sensation to overrule understanding. This was the source of his difficulty. But of course, if we were to pay attention to our experience, if we were to let an ordinary walk become a true experience, then we would feel something of what Serra felt. Retracing our steps, the light would have changed, the ocean would be on the left instead of the right, and so on. This very fact that Serra could not, quote, understand why that would be, a memory that stayed with him throughout his life, indicates that, despite his young age, he'd absorbed the social or cultural principle that personal experience shouldn't contradict collective, generalized knowledge. Walking down and up the beach, the boy was, so to speak, reverting from the culture he had absorbed to the nature that surrounded him. Or to avoid this dreadful cliche, culture to nature, I might say that Serra was perceiving the world as if culture had never befallen him. Walking back was not the inversion of walking forward, but a completely independent experience. His openness to experience prevented his acquired conceptual generalizations from taking charge of his senses. Although Serra engineers his sculptures and prints with great precision, his logic of construction seems negated by the compelling emotional draw of his art. His art exceeds the degree of order designed to generate it. Recall the question he asked himself at an early moment. What if you just took an action in relation to a material and didn't worry about the results? This doesn't mean that Serra's art is random, for he edits all the results ruthlessly. But it does mean that he remains open to novel aesthetic effects. Serra's later etchings, this one is from 1999, have the novelty that he associated with a walk on a beach or any walk around his own sculpture. Each print within an edition becomes unique because of its grand scale, the depth of its etch, and the corresponding physicality of the massive amount of ink that fills the plate. Just as walking up the beach didn't equal walking down the beach, Serra's prints are multiples that deny any strict repetition. Today, Serra is probably best known for his torqued ellipses. These structures, virtually architectural spaces, affect a body's equilibrium so dramatically that you become ever more aware of your bodily presence. You become the subjectivity of this art, not Serra, as you adjust your body, mind, and sensibility to the form of the sculpture and how it shapes space as both interior and exterior. The torqued ellipses began with complex volumes and have only grown more complex. Serra uses drawings and prints to assess in 2 dimensions how his work in 3 dimensions feels. I'll close with one of his well-known statements related to his notion that thinking and feeling must be integrated, and drawing is the key to accomplishing this condition. Thought and language, Serra says, are interdependent, but drawing comes from another source. It comes from experience and intuition. Thinking with words is not the model. The experience in drawing is not obtained through language. Language doesn't equal experience, it points to it. Drawing creates its own ordering. To draw a line is to have an idea. Drawing is a way for me to carry on an interior monologue with the making as I'm making it. The etching now on the screen reflects Serra's experience of both the torqued ellipse and, perhaps all the more, the linear form itself as Serra feels it, thinks it, draws it. It isn't a dependent reference, but an independent thought. I would put Serra's notion of line this way. His line is a felt thought. His experience at the beach was also a felt thought. He had an intellectual realization that, despite the logic of it, down and up were not commutable. In this print of 2001, when Serra traced out the elliptical forms, he may have been trying to grasp what the visceral experience of torquing can be. I don't say what the experience can be like. It's not a question of relating one thing to another thing, finding similarities and metaphors. It's a question of what is. The experience of making the print is its own thing, just as seeing is its own thing, and touching, and feeling, and thinking. Thank you.